Hello, my friends. So, asking the establishment today, asking the mainstream, the average person who's plugged into the mainstream matrix, so to speak, to be able to give a rational, coherent explanation of the decline of society that has happened over the past 150 years is like asking a person with severe brain damage to explain how their decline took place, and expecting that person with severe brain damage to be able to relate back to when they were healthy and functioning. It's impossible. Most people today are completely out of touch and have no contact or perspective whatsoever on how different society was, how much healthier in so many ways society was just 100, 120, 150 years ago. And this thought comes to mind for me when I read something like I have been reading, The Foundations of the 19th Century by Houston Stewart Chamberlain. Because reading a work of history and anthropology like that was written in the late 1900s or the late 1800s, it always strikes me how much better writing was back then, and how much more coherent people's understanding of the world was back then, when all of these, taboos about race, about sex, about all these different social taboos about the you-know-whos, they didn't exist back then, and people could think more clearly without those taboos arresting that type of thought before it even occurs. So it was just much clearer back then. But it's not just that, it's the mastery of language that writers had back then that's completely unparalleled today. And I started really thinking about this idea that the old writers at the end of the 19th and the early 20th century, probably the last one I could think of is Tolkien, who wrote at this level of mastery, how that mastery is truly unparalleled today. And it made me wonder what happened. How did we lose this? How did we as a culture, as a Western culture and society, lose these great writers? Why don't they happen anymore today? Why aren't there any writers who can write this way anymore? And I started looking for answers about this. And one video that I found that sort of touches on the subject is a video on YouTube, but I'll put it in the description, called something like "Why Presidential Speeches Are Getting Dumber," or have gotten dumber. And this video focuses specifically on presidential speeches, obviously. And it qualifies the word dumber as based on a certain assessment, like a sort of objective, almost mathematical assessment of the language used in presidential speeches that counts the vocabulary, it counts syllables per word, words per sentence, and it kind of factors these all into a score that determines the difficulty of the language. And what they found is that this decline in language difficulty was not sort of a steady slope downwards from George Washington to Joe Biden. It was not a gradual, steady decline. It was more or less consistent throughout the 17 and 1800s. And then in the sort of early mid 20th century, from about the 20s to the 30s, 40s, that era, there was a sudden drop-off, which very quickly declined to what we see today, where presidents are literally speaking at like a 7th or a 6th grade level. They're speaking to 12-year-olds, basically, or 13-year-olds. And the way they try to explain this is by saying that, well, in the early part of the 20th century, the constituencies of politicians was expanding. Women got the vote. Senators became elected by popular majority or by popular elections, and public schools became more prevalent. So politicians, this is what they say, had to appeal to the more common person, the common man and woman now, since women at that time were getting the vote, they had to address those common sorts of folks. And this highfalutin vocabulary of the 19th century, this was privileged white man stuff. This is what they say in the video. This is how rich white people spoke. And politics back then was a privileged, rich white person thing. So this dumbing down of vocabulary, it's actually a good thing, because it's no longer just about these privileged white men. It's about the common man. Having a dumb vocabulary, having a lack of vocabulary, and a lack of mastery over the English language, that's something you should be proud in, because that's egalitarian. That's the great equalizer. You don't want to be part of this privileged, elite white man class, do you? So this is how they explain it. But the fact is that it wasn't only presidential speeches that were declining. And you might be able to explain the appeal to this common crowd as being involved in sort of some political agenda to appeal to the wider base of poor people in society. But you can't really use that explanation when it comes to literature, when it comes to poetry, when it comes to these sorts of artistic endeavors. Art in the 19th century was done for art's sake, for the sake of just producing the greatest possible product or artifact. And moving forward, there's no reason for artists to try to appeal to any common working Joe who doesn't have a good vocabulary. Why did literature decline in this same way? Because it's not just vocabulary that declined, or syllables per word, or words per sentence. It's the style. I don't know if you've ever read modern day philosophical works, which once again isn't the type of literature that is written to appeal to the common man. Philosophy literature that you'll read today in university, even at the highest levels, is in no way in the same class as a writer like Nietzsche, or even a writer like Aristotle or any of the sort of classical philosophers prior to the 20th century. It's not just vocabulary. It's not just words per sentence or syllables per word. It's the ability to have this sort of artistic style, this beautiful, soulful way of writing that is lacking today. Philosophy books today are extremely dry, extremely technical, and even though they have wide vocabulary, they use a lot of big technical words. A lot of the times those words are really, what would you call, the type of jargon that is actually meant to confuse people and make themselves seem more sophisticated, when in reality they're words that could be repeated with more common terms in a lot more clear of a way. But anyway, so this isn't something that has been contained only within politicians' speeches. It's also in literature and poetry and philosophy writings. So their explanation kind of falls apart there, and this is something I probably should have mentioned earlier in the video because this is important. The average person, this so-called common man that had a dumb vocabulary before the 20th century, or during the 20th century, prior to the 20th century, say, for instance, during the Civil War, their vocabulary was way better. Or during the Revolutionary War, their vocabulary, their mastery of language was far superior. You look at the letters that soldiers wrote to their wives at home, or you look at the pamphlets that were distributed during the Revolutionary War period, or even the Farmer's Almanac, for crying out loud, that Benjamin Franklin distributed to farmers. Look at how they wrote, and you can see that the common man back in that time had a far superior mastery over language. And look, this is important because a mastery of language implies a mastery over concepts. The more words you can apply, the more specific your language is, the more detailed and rich your language is, the more detailed and rich your conceptual understanding is, because words stand for concepts. This is something that I think just about every good writer and thinker has ever known. This is why someone like George Orwell, for example, talks about how controlling speech in 1984 was one of the main objectives of the party, because the more you can limit and control people's language, the more you can limit and control people's thoughts. The richer your vocabulary, the more nuanced your vocabulary and your linguistic application can be, the more nuanced your concepts are, your conceptual understanding and your intelligence is. Every new concept is labeled with a word, and the more detailed, rich, like I've already said, nuanced your conceptual understanding is, the more angles you can approach an idea, the more words you end up needing. So this, decline in language it represents a decline in intelligence, without question. And if the common man back in the Revolutionary War, the Civil War period and up until the early part of the 20th century had a greater mastery of language. What happened that caused this decline across the board? Not just in politics, but in, like I said, literature, art, philosophy. This decline, like I've said, I'll repeat, not just in vocabulary, but in style, in grace. What happened? Well, one of the things that this video about presidential speeches getting dumber got right, in my opinion, and I think unintentionally, what it got right, was public school. The public school system, over the course of the 20th century, expanded greater and greater to more and more, it gained more and more students. It became harder and harder to avoid, with women starting to work. Men and women now are both working in the factory. The children are sent to public schools. And these public schools are, and I think from the beginning have been, tools of control. They have deliberately dumbed down the population. And this is something that writers such as Charlotte Iserby, John Taylor Gatto, and many other writers and thinkers have discussed. You can look up The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America by Charlotte Iserby. There's numerous interviews with her. The Hidden Lessons of Public School by John Taylor Gatto. Look these books up, look up these ideas, and you'll see that there's, I think, unquestionably an agenda to dumb down, to make children dumber through the public school system, and in doing so, to make them less of a threat to the political system. Because dumb children grow up to be dumb adults. And dumb adults are much easier to control than smart adults. So, moral of the story, I guess, is don't put your kids into public school. Have them read books by the old masters. Because this is something, once again, it's like trying to get people to see this is like trying to get somebody who's brain damaged to see how smart they were before. Once you're brain damaged, it's almost impossible for you to even conceive of how it was to be more intelligent, because you're brain damaged. And most people have never read literature from the 19th century or even the early 20th century. And if they have, the significance of how much more beautiful and masterful the language was back then just goes right over their heads. Most people are they lack perspective on this entirely. So, once again, keep your kids out of public school. Thanks for listening to my rant. Felt like ranting about that today. And thanks for watching, as always.